What would you do if your own family set you up to fail just to watch you squirm? My name is Amber Wilson. I'm 28, a marketing specialist from a quiet town in rural Massachusetts. And tonight I'm sitting in a crystal-draped private room at Lucille, the most exclusive restaurant in Boston, trying to pretend like I belong here. The waiter has just dropped off a leather folder with a number inside that could buy a luxury car. $180. My sister-in-law, Madison, looks straight at me and says, "Oh, sis-in-law, we forgot our purse and cards." That's when the silence hits, the kind that makes your ears ring, the kind that turns every eye in the room toward you. My checking account has $17 in it. My credit cards are maxed out. I feel like I can't breathe. But let me take you back, because this dinner, this trap, it didn't start here. It started the moment I fell in love with a man named Ryan Thompson. I met Ryan my junior year at Boston University. He was tall, kind, and nothing like the other business students who bragged about internships in Singapore and wore designer watches to class. He drove a sensible car, wore beat-up sneakers, and actually listened when people spoke. It took me 3 months to learn that Ryan came from one of the most powerful restaurant dynasties in New England. "It's just restaurants," he said with a shrug. Just restaurants. Try 37 fine dining locations, a family compound in Martha's Vineyard, and a private jet for emergencies. Meeting the Thompsons felt like stepping onto the set of a prestige drama. Richard Ryan's father was the self-made empire builder, charming in a commanding sort of way with a memory like a steel trap and a wine cellar worth millions. Elizabeth Ryan's mother came from old Boston money, elegant, soft-spoken, and always watching with those sharp, evaluating eyes. Then there was Madison, Ryan's little sister, polished to perfection, draped in designer labels, the kind of woman who looks you up and down and catalogs your worth before you've even introduced yourself. The first time we met, she glanced at my department store dress and said, "Marketing. How interesting. I suppose even five-star restaurants need someone to manage their Instagram." It stung. But I smiled, because Ryan made me feel like I belonged. Our relationship grew despite the silent scrutiny. When Ryan proposed, he gave me his grandmother's ring, a beautiful heirloom Madison later critiqued at our engagement party, whispering to him, "You couldn't have had it reset in platinum." Our wedding wasn't Vogue-worthy like Madison's, which featured a Grammy-winning artist and a fleet of floral drones. But it was real. It was us. And for a while, I believed that would be enough. We bought a cozy brownstone in Boston's South End. I kept my job at a boutique marketing firm. Ryan chose to work his way up the Thompson Company the hard way, earning every promotion. We paid our own bills, budgeted responsibly, and still argued over how much oat milk costs. But we were proud of the life we were building. Madison didn't see it that way. She and her husband Derek lived in a glass-walled apartment overlooking Boston Harbor, drove matching Bentleys, and treated our cute little place like it was a starter home for a college intern. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual brunch was laced with subtle daggers. "Amber, do you still work? Amber, that dress is so vintage. Ryan, when are you going to take a real role at the company?" She smiled through every jab, but I felt them all, deep. 6 months before Richard and Elizabeth's 40th wedding anniversary, the family gathered over lobster bisque to plan the celebration. Madison lit up at the mention of Lucille, the Michelin-starred crown jewel of Boston, dining where a basic salad costs more than my car payment. "I know the executive chef," she said. "Let me take the lead." Elizabeth nodded. "We want to keep it intimate, just family and closest friends. 40 people. Then Richard dropped the bomb. "We'll split the cost evenly between the kids. Your mother and I just want to enjoy the evening without worrying." I felt my stomach knot, even split, when one couple flies first class for fun and the other just maxed a card to fix a bathroom leak. Later that night, I asked Ryan, "How much do you think our part will be?" He shrugged. "Maybe a few thousand. We didn't have a few thousand to spare, but I didn't say no. I didn't push back. because part of me still wanted to prove I could handle this, that I deserved to sit at their table. I picked up freelance work, canceled my gym membership, packed tuna sandwiches for lunch, all while Madison sent daily emails with seating charts, imported flower options, and champagne lists that made me dizzy. And then came the lunch. 3 weeks before the dinner, Madison invited the ladies to a preparation day spa lunch shopping. I told her I couldn't make it. She insisted. Lunch was at a French bistro where a glass of water cost $12. When the check arrived, Madison smiled sweetly. Oh no, I left my wallet in the rush. Amber, do you mind $412? I handed over my card. Grocery delivery canceled. Again. That night, as I collapsed onto the couch, Ryan asked, "How was your day with Madison?" "She made me pay for her lunch," I said, holding back tears, and tried to shame me into buying a $1,000 dress for her parents' dinner. Ryan sighed. "She's just Madison. Tomorrow will be better." He was wrong. The real test was yet to come. The day of the Thompson anniversary celebration arrived like a storm front, glamorous, expensive, and impossible to avoid. Ryan and I took an Uber to Lucille. Parking would have cost $60, and that was money we couldn't spare. But stepping into that glass tower, I felt instantly out of place. The elevator opened to a marble foyer with soft piano music and hosts in three-piece suits. A hostess greeted us like we were royalty. "Welcome to Lucille. You're here for the Thompson party." Ryan nodded, and we were whisked away past Boston's elite clinking glasses, over foie gras and oysters, into the private dining room. It was like walking into a wedding designed by a luxury magazine. Thousands of white roses, crystal chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. I caught my reflection in the glass, the dress I'd bought from the sale rack, the necklace I borrowed from my mom. I looked presentable, but in a room full of couture, presentable felt like failure. Elizabeth greeted me with a warm hug. "You look lovely, dear," she said, her hand lingering a little longer than usual. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was her way of saying, "I see you." Madison and Derek swept in behind us like they were walking a red carpet. Her gown shimmered like starlight. His cufflinks probably cost more than my entire outfit. The seating chart, undoubtedly arranged by Madison, placed them directly across from us, where every glance and comment could be delivered with maximum effect. The sommelier arrived presenting a bottle of Dom Pérignon with the reverence of a holy artifact. A rare vintage, he intoned, selected specifically for the Thompsons' celebration. Richard raised his glass. To 40 years with the woman who built this life beside me. To family, Elizabeth added, her eyes resting briefly on me. The first course arrived Ostra caviar gold leaf creme fraiche. I hesitated. Small fork, tiny spoon, I copied Ryan. Madison noticed. "Amber," she said sweetly, "not to your taste?" I smiled tightly, just savoring the moment. It's not every day you enjoy something so special. She leaned closer. "Of course. I forget not everyone is used to fine dining. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Like she was patting me on the head for learning to use utensils, but I kept my chin high. I wouldn't let her see me sweat. The courses came and went. Truffle, lobster, wagyu, beef, wild forage mushrooms, flown in from Japan. With each plate, a new wine, white red, something sparkling. I quietly asked for water after the fourth pour. Madison didn't miss a beat. "Not drinking the Bordeaux," she said loudly. "It's over $2,000 a bottle. Dad had it imported specially. I just want to remember every bite I said. It's all incredible." She smiled that thin, perfect smile. How sensible. And then after dessert, a chocolate torte with actual 24-karat gold shavings. Madison rose from her seat with a little clink-clink of her glass. "I just want to say..." She began, her voice silky and loud enough for every guest to hear how much it means to all of us to be here tonight. I braced myself. As a token of our gratitude, the children have decided to cover the cost of this evening as our gift to Mom and Dad. A murmur of admiration rippled through the room. Richard looked surprised. Elizabeth blinked. I turned to Ryan. "Did you know about this?" He shook his head, panic flashing across his face. The restaurant manager appeared almost on cue with the bill in hand. He handed it to Madison with a bow, as requested. Madison glanced at the total, smiled faintly, and passed it to Derek. I caught the twitch of his brow, the only hint that the number inside was staggering. Then it came to us. Ryan opened the folder. $180,000. Even divided our share was impossible. Madison leaned toward us. So? Shall we settle up between couples before we present the official gift? I felt myself sliding into a black hole of panic. I gripped the table, willing myself not to cry. Ryan stood his voice low. Madison, now's not the time. And then the moment that would live in infamy. Oh, sis-in-law, Madison exclaimed loud enough for the next table to hear. We forgot our purse and cards. Derek joined in, chuckling. Left them right on the kitchen counter. Such a shame. The restaurant manager, sensing tension, lingered nearby. Richard's voice carried from the head of the table. Is there a problem? My voice was steady, strong. Finally. Yes, I said. There's a problem. And every fork in the room stopped moving. I stood. Madison has arranged for Ryan and me to cover half of this $180,000 dinner. She knows we can't afford it. She did it anyway. And now she's pretending she forgot her wallet to make us pay. A wave of silence. Elizabeth gasped. Richard's expression darkened. Madison blinked. It was meant to be a surprise gift. We didn't know you were struggling. We're not struggling, Ryan said. We're making smart choices. We just don't have $90,000 to drop on dinner, and you knew that. The room froze. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care anymore. I'd been silent too long. Then, something unexpected. Richard started laughing. It wasn't cruel, it was genuine, hearty laughter, the kind that made his eyes tear up. Elizabeth joined in, covering her mouth to stifle a giggle. Dad Madison said, bewildered. Mom Richard stood wiping his eyes. Madison, did you really think I'd let my children foot the bill for this? She blinked. We wanted to surprise you. Elizabeth's voice was calm but cutting. Surprises require consent and respect. Richard addressed the guests. Apologies for the drama. Everything tonight was arranged and paid for weeks ago. There was never any expectation that our kids would pay. This was our gift to you. A wave of relief hit me so hard I nearly sat back down. But it wasn't over yet. Richard turned toward Madison and Derek, his jovial warmth now replaced with calm authority. We'll discuss this privately, he said, gesturing to the remaining guests with a practiced host's grace. But I want to be absolutely clear. This celebration was never meant to test anyone's wallet. It was meant to celebrate love, 40 years of it, not to be turned into a game of who can flex harder. Madison stood frozen, a perfectly controlled mask of surprise on her face. But her eyes, they darted, calculating, searching for a way to spin this. It wasn't about money, she said. We just wanted to make it special for you and Mom. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice gentler but no less piercing. The only thing special tonight was your attempt to humiliate your brother and Amber, publicly. For what a spectacle, it's not like that. Madison protested, looking around, hoping anyone might jump to her defense. But the room was still, silent. No. Elizabeth continued her posture, impeccable, her voice still polite. Because I've watched you do this for years. The forgotten wallet, the backhanded compliments, the subtle comments about Amber's clothes or her job. Enough. Madison opened her mouth, closed it. Even Derek, usually smooth and smug, was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He finally spoke. I think there's just been a misunderstanding. Richard turned slowly toward his son-in-law. Derek. In all the years I've known you, I've never seen you once challenge Madison's behavior. Not once. You don't misunderstand this. You enable it. A few guests quietly excused themselves, sensing the moment had turned from uncomfortable to seismic. The rest tried to pretend their digestives were the most interesting thing in the room. Then Ryan stood. Madison, If you had questions about what we could contribute, you could have asked. But instead, you orchestrated a moment designed to embarrass Amber. You wanted us to look small, weak, out of place. I stared at the pristine white tablecloth, my fingers tracing a gold-etched pattern I hadn't noticed before. My heart was pounding, my face was flushed, but something in me had changed. "I've been quiet," I said, lifting my head. "I've let the comments slide, the judgments, the digs about my clothes or my background. But this wasn't subtle. This was a calculated attempt to humiliate me, to paint us as the poor relations just to make yourself feel bigger." Madison's cheeks flamed, but she didn't speak. Then Elizabeth crossed the room and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're right, Amber," she said, looking directly at her daughter. "Empathy has never been your strong suit, Madison, but it's not too late to develop it." The string quartet, which had gone quiet during the confrontation, began playing softly again, but the mood had shifted. The air was thinner now, more real. Madison sank back into her chair. Her posture, always impeccable, finally slumped. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," she murmured. Whether it was regret or just embarrassment, I couldn't tell, but it was the first time I'd seen a crack in her perfect armor. Later, as the guests filtered out, Elizabeth hugged me tightly. "We've always seen your value, Amber," she whispered, "even when others didn't." Richard followed behind, pulling me into a firm embrace. "Thank you for loving my son for who he is not, what he has," he said loudly, making sure Madison heard every word. In the elevator down from Lucille, the silence between the four of us was thick and heavy. Ryan, his arm around my waist, looked straight ahead. Derek checked his phone. Madison stared at her reflection in the mirrored wall. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "It wasn't supposed to go that way." Ryan turned to her. "Then how was it supposed to go?" She didn't answer. That night, back at home, we opened a $12 bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. We sat at our scratched wooden table, lit a candle, and breathed. "You okay?" Ryan asked, brushing a strand of hair from my face. I nodded slowly. "I think so. I never expected your parents to see through it all, to stand up for us like that." Ryan exhaled. "Honestly, I didn't either." We sat in silence for a moment. The city lights glimmered through our window, a soft reminder of the chaos we'd just escaped. "You know what I realized tonight," Ryan said. "What I've spent so long trying to keep peace in the family that I never questioned how much that peace cost you." I looked at him. "It's not all on you. I let it happen too. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, maybe I'd earn a place, but I had one all along, I just didn't claim it." He raised his glass, to finally seeing what was always there. I smiled, and to not paying $90,000 for dinner. We clinked glasses, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not just by Ryan, but by myself. The next morning, we dressed for brunch at Richard and Elizabeth's townhouse in Beacon Hill. The place looked like something from a historical drama, grand, classic, and intimidating. As we climbed the stone steps, my nerves returned. What now would yesterday's honesty be swept under the rug? Would Madison be back to her old tricks? Would Derek pretend nothing had happened? But when the door opened, Elizabeth greeted us with fresh-baked cinnamon rolls, a warm smile, and no trace of awkwardness. "Coffee's fresh," she said. "Let's sit. We've got a bit to talk through." Madison and Derek were already there, seated at the table, both unusually quiet. Richard folded his paper and looked at us all. "I want to address what happened last night." And suddenly, I knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Richard folded his paper, took off his glasses, and set them down carefully. The room was quiet, no clinking dishes, no background music, just the scent of cinnamon and the weight of truth waiting to be spoken. "I want to address what happened last night." He began, voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Madison, your mother and I have thought about it. A lot." Madison sat up straighter, her expression unreadable. "I already apologized," she said. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "To whom?" Madison glanced quickly at me, then back to her untouched plate. "To Amber. And Ryan." I'm sorry for putting you both in an uncomfortable position. It wasn't my intention. Richard leaned forward. Wasn't it? The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Madison, he continued, this isn't about one dinner. This is about a pattern, the little digs, the subtle positioning, the pressure you put on people to match your version of success, even when you know it's beyond their means. Derek shifted awkwardly next to her. Richard, I think. Elizabeth cut in smoothly. Perhaps, Derek, this is a moment to listen. Madison flushed her voice defensive. You make it sound like I'm deliberately cruel, that I meant to embarrass them. Ryan spoke next, his voice quiet but resolute. You didn't have to mean it for it to hurt. Madison's eyes flicked to me. I was trying to include you, she said. All those events, the dinners, the shopping, the brunches, it was my way of bringing you in. On your terms, I replied, not mine. That's when Elizabeth reached for Richard's hand and said something that shifted the entire table. After you were born, we promised ourselves we'd give you every opportunity. And maybe we went too far. Madison stared at her mother bewildered. Too far, Richard nodded slowly. We never taught you that real inclusion comes from understanding not status. We gave you things, yes, but we didn't always give you perspective. And then something unexpected happened. Elizabeth turned to me with a small, knowing smile. Amber, would you walk with me? I think the father-children conversation needs a moment without us. We stepped into the Thompsons' back garden, a carefully designed haven in the heart of Beacon Hill. Ivy curled up old brick walls. Roses bloomed in neat rows. The stone path crunched beneath our shoes. Elizabeth didn't speak for a while. She just walked slowly. Her arm looped through mine until we reached a wrought iron bench beneath a climbing arch of jasmine. I want to tell you something I've never told Madison, she said softly. I looked at her surprised. Everyone assumes I grew up with wealth, she began. Old Boston money, that's technically true. The family name, the house, the history, they were all real. But by the time I was born, the fortune was nearly gone. All that remained was a name and a few heirlooms. She paused, picking a small leaf from her sleeve. My parents hosted grand dinners and attended elite galas, but we ate leftovers in the kitchen after the guests left. They lived to keep up appearances. That must have been hard, I said quietly. It was confusing, she replied, because I thought that was love. Polished silver, practiced smiles, a perfectly ironed world that never admitted when things were hard. She looked at me, then really looked. When I met Richard, he was working as a line cook, taking night classes in business. My parents were horrified, but he had something more valuable than any trust fund. He had integrity. Her voice softened. When Ryan brought you home, I saw that same light in you, the quiet strength, the way you looked at him like you saw the man, not the money. I felt something tighten in my throat. I'd spent years trying to be enough for this family only to discover I already was. Elizabeth touched the jasmine arch as we stood. Madison has never learned to see value beyond the surface, but you remind me of who I was before the name and expectations blurred everything. We walked back in silence, but her hand never left my arm. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Richard sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him, like he was leading a boardroom meeting. Madison's posture had softened. Derek looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last hour. As of tomorrow, Richard was saying Madison will be working directly with our community outreach team. I want you meeting with our scholarship recipients, listening, learning. Madison didn't protest, just nodded slowly, and Derek Richard continued turning to him. You'll be joining the Employee Financial Planning Committee, helping staff at all levels learn how to build sustainable futures. I expect you to treat every line cook with the same respect you show our investors. Ryan raised his eyebrows. Madison's mouth opened slightly, but still she said nothing. Elizabeth and I took our seats. Richard looked at Ryan and me. Your choices, living within your means, building your own paths, those aren't weaknesses. They're strengths. They remind us what we built this family on effort, not entitlement. Elizabeth nodded. Richard started with one diner and a dream. He didn't ask my family for money. He asked for belief, and he earned everything I added. Richard raised his coffee mug. Here's to the real builders, the ones who don't need a spotlight to shine. As the brunch wrapped up, Madison approached me while Ryan chatted with his father. Amber, she said, her voice lower than I'd ever heard it, I owe you a real apology, not just for last night, for everything. I turned to face her. I've judged you for not having what I had, she continued, but the truth is, I never earned any of it. I don't know what it's like to work for something and wonder if it's good enough. I stayed silent, letting her speak. I don't expect us to be close overnight, she said, but I'd like to try again. To get to know you as my brother's wife, not as someone I have to compete with. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. And for the first time, Madison looked like she was really seeing me not as a project, not as a problem, but as a person. In the weeks that followed the $180,000 dinner debacle, something began to shift, not just in the Thompson family, but in me. It started small. Madison, true to her word, began her work with the Thompson Foundation's Community Outreach Program. I half expected it to be a performative role, a box checked another photo op in designer heels. But to my surprise, she showed up, quietly, without an entourage. At first, she hovered at the edges, uncomfortable among the young scholarship recipients and restaurant staff who looked at her like she came from another planet. But slowly, her edges softened. She started asking questions, listening, taking notes. One of the program coordinators, a single mom from Dorchester, told me, "Your sister-in-law's got a lot to learn, but at least she's finally learning." Derek, for his part, joined the Employee Finance Committee with similar reluctance. His spreadsheets were impeccable, but it was clear this wasn't his comfort zone. Still, he attended every meeting, sat beside line cooks, dishwashers, and barbacks without flinching. When one of the prep cooks, a 22-year-old saving for nursing school, asked about 401ks, Derek didn't brush her off. He explained it in plain English, slowly, patiently. Maybe that was Richard's gift, knowing when to push his kids out of their comfort zones, instead of just writing checks to smooth the edges. As for Ryan and me, something deeper had changed. We no longer walked into family gatherings with knots in our stomachs or silent calculations of whether we could afford to keep up. We hosted a small dinner in our brownstone a month after the infamous night at Lucille. No caterers, no imported truffles, just pasta garlic bread and a homemade dessert that I accidentally burned a little. And they all came, Madison and Derek included. They sat at our thrifted table under the mismatched lights we'd strung across the ceiling. They drank wine from glasses that didn't match. And for the first time ever, no one commented on our cute little place. In fact, halfway through the evening, Madison complimented my playlist, and meant it. Elizabeth brought flowers hand-picked from her garden, and Richard brought his famous bourbon, declaring it too good for crystal, perfect for real conversation. The room felt warm, not performative, not polite, real. After dinner, as we gathered in the living room with coffee and old stories, Richard raised his glass. To homes built on truth, he said, his eyes twinkling. Not marble countertops. Elizabeth added, and to women who bring strength not by demanding a seat, but by quietly becoming the table. She looked at me when she said it. I'll never forget that moment. A few weeks later, Madison sent me a text. Madison, hey, could I get your advice on something marketing related, trying to boost the visibility of our scholarship program? I stared at the message for a full minute. It wasn't dripping with sarcasm. It wasn't disguised as a favor. It was a request for help. From me. I typed back, me absolutely. Happy to help anytime. It wasn't an instant transformation. There were still awkward pauses at brunches, still remnants of old rivalry in the way she double-checked her outfit against mine. But something fundamental had shifted. The war was over, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped playing her game. One afternoon, Elizabeth invited me to join her at a women's leadership luncheon. I assumed I'd be seated in the back, a guest among names far more prominent than mine. But when I arrived, she introduced me to a group of CEOs and nonprofit directors as my daughter-in-law, Amber, one of the smartest strategic minds I've encountered in years. The room nodded. I smiled. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an imposter wearing borrowed confidence. I belonged. Months passed. The scholarship program grew, community outreach expanded. Madison began speaking at events not as the polished heiress, but as someone who'd learned humility the hard way. She even credited Amber Wilson in a few of her public remarks, noting that some of the best lessons come from the people you once misunderstood. Derek stopped trying to impress everyone and started showing up for the staff who actually needed his skills. And Ryan. He finally accepted a leadership role in the family business, but on his terms. He didn't chase titles. He built mentorship programs for young restaurant managers. He made room at the table for people like his father once was hungry, driven, and overlooked. Late one night, Ryan and I were cleaning up after another quiet dinner with friends. He pulled me into a slow spin between the kitchen island and the fridge, laughing as I nearly stepped on his foot. "You know what I realized tonight?" he whispered. I smiled. What now were the richest people I know? And he was right. Not because of the silverware, not because of the wine, but because we had love, real, hard-earned, truth-wrapped love. Because I had stood up finally, not for approval, but for myself. And because, in a room full of chandeliers and champagne, I found the only thing that really mattered: belonging. The funny thing about family is how often we mistake silence for harmony and politeness for peace. For years, I'd smiled through backhanded compliments. I'd swallowed shame with expensive wine. I'd fought to belong in a world that was never built with someone like me in mind. But what I learned through the sharp edges of a $180,000 dinner and the humiliation Madison tried to serve alongside dessert is: this real belonging doesn't come from fitting in. It comes from standing up. In the months following that night, I began to understand something deeper about the Thompsons. The wealth was never the problem. It was the weight of legacy status and appearances that had warped it. Madison wasn't evil. She was simply lost inside a bubble that told her worth was measured in gifts with commas and clothes that never went on sale. But here's the twist no one saw coming. It wasn't her grand gesture that left a legacy. It was my quiet resistance. Because while Madison planned seating charts and Instagram-worthy centerpieces, I was building a different kind of empire, one made of trust, honesty, and grit. A few weeks after our family dinner, Richard invited me to a board meeting for the Thompson Foundation. Not as a favor, he clarified, as a partner. I took the seat not to prove anything to Madison or to finally earn Elizabeth's approval, but because I believed I could make a difference. I used my marketing skills to help them rebrand outreach programs, rework the messaging to appeal to the communities they actually served, not just donors in tuxedos. And when Madison presented her first proposal for a mentorship initiative, connecting scholarship recipients with professionals, I was the one who helped her tighten the pitch. We didn't become best friends overnight, but we became real. One spring morning, I found myself back in the kitchen of our brownstone. The same scratched table, the same wobbly chair Ryan still hasn't fixed. I was prepping a presentation when a letter slid through the mail slot. It was handwritten from Elizabeth. Inside a short note, Amber. When you married into our family, I welcomed you as my son's wife. But somewhere along the way, you became something else entirely. A compass, a reminder, a force. Thank you for helping all of us find our way back to what matters. With love, Elizabeth, I held that note for a long time because it said everything I'd ever needed to hear. On the 1-year anniversary of that infamous dinner, Ryan and I returned to Lucille. Not for drama, but for closure. We sat at a corner table, just the two of us. No chandeliers, no caviar, just wine and laughter and a waiter who didn't blink when I asked for tap water. We toasted not to the family we married into or the money they carried, but to us, to the lessons, to the strength it took to speak, to the silence we finally broke. So, if you're watching this and you've ever felt like you didn't belong, like you had to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's expectations, this story is for you. If you've ever been the outsider at the table, know this: you don't need to change to earn respect. You don't need to pretend to be wealthy, powerful, or polished to deserve a seat. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to say, "This isn't right." Sometimes you don't have to buy the dinner to win the night. Have you ever felt like an outsider in your partner's family or your own? Did you speak up? Did it change things? Tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button. Subscribe for more powerful stories about navigating family betrayal and reclaiming your voice. And if you made it to the end, thank you. Truly. I hope you feel a little more seen today. Because in a world full of $180,000 distractions, what really matters is knowing who you are and never letting anyone price you out of your own worth.